Rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield as Laura struggled to keep her old sedan on the slick road. It had been a long day, and all she wanted was to get home. Her headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing only a serpentine stretch of highway that seemed to wind endlessly into the night. Just as she was about to turn onto the familiar road that would lead her home, another car roared up behind her. The blaring of its horns startled her. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw a dark SUV, its headlights burning fiercely. She had been driving under the speed limit, trying to stay cautious, but the driver behind her was clearly impatient. Laura's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel tighter, her frustration growing. She tried to speed up, but the SUV stayed close, almost as if it was daring her to make a mistake. The aggressive driver flashed their high beams, creating a strobe effect that made it hard for Laura to see. She reached for her phone, hoping to call the police, but before she could dial, the SUV swerved into the other lane, pulling alongside her. Through the rain-smeared window, Laura saw a figure in the driver's seat, their face hidden behind the darkened glass. The SUV's driver leaned on the horn again, the noise echoing in Laura's ears. Panicking, Laura floored the gas pedal and her car lurched forward, but the SUV kept pace, as if it were a predator stalking its prey. Laura glanced at the empty road ahead, hoping for a way to escape this terrifying chase, but the road seemed to stretch out endlessly. Then, the SUV abruptly changed lanes, cutting her off. Laura slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. Her heart raced as she regained control, but the SUV didn't stop. Instead, it sped up, gaining ground quickly. Laura's hands trembled as she fought to keep her car steady. The headlights of the SUV were blinding, and she felt a cold sweat on the back of her neck. Desperation clawed at her, and she decided to pull off onto a less-traveled side road, hoping to lose the relentless driver. The side road was narrow and winding, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow up the light. Laura's headlights barely penetrated the darkness. She drove as fast as she dared, and her pulse hammering in her ears. The SUV's headlights still glared in her rearview mirror, unrelenting. Suddenly, the road took a sharp turn, and Laura struggled to navigate the curve. The SUV, however, seemed to take the turn with ease, its lights growing closer again. Fear surged through Laura as she realized that her attempt to escape had only led her further into isolation. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for her car. She glanced around, looking for a place to hide, but the road was deserted. Then she saw it. A small, dilapidated house set back from the road, its windows dark and vacant. Laura's instincts screamed at her to keep moving, but the SUV's constant pursuit left her with few options. She pulled up to the house, hoping that the darkness would conceal her car. She shut off the engine and the lights, then watched with bated breath as the SUV's headlights swept past. The SUV slowed down, then stopped. Laura held her breath, praying that the driver would move on. For a moment, the world was silent except for the sound of the rain tapping against the car. But then a figure emerged from the SUV, a tall silhouette against the faint glow of its brake lights. Laura watched in horror as the figure approached the house, their movements deliberate. She could barely make out their features, but the sheer menacing presence of the stranger sent shivers down her spine. The figure reached the front door of the house and knocked. A chilling silence followed. Laura's mind raced. What should she do? She couldn't stay in the car forever. With a sense of dread, she decided to take her chances and slip out of the vehicle. She opened the door slowly, wincing at the creak, and peered out. The figure was still at the door, their back turned to her. She made a run for it, dashing across the rain-slicked ground toward the house. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling like an eternity. She reached the front door, the heavy wood feeling strangely comforting as she fumbled with the knob. It was locked. Desperation mounting, Laura pounded on the door, but there was no response from inside. The figure was still at the door, their back unmoving. A gut-wrenching thought crossed her mind. What if the house was abandoned? Suddenly, the door creaked open and Laura stumbled inside, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The interior was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. She quickly shut the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. The figure outside hammered on the door, and Laura could hear their angry shouts. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, and she dialed 911, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. The operator was calm and reassuring, promising that help was on the way. Laura's eyes darted around the room, trying to find a place to hide. The house seemed empty, but then she noticed a door at the far end, slightly ajar. Without thinking, Laura crept toward it, her heart pounding louder with every step. She pushed the door open and stepped into a small room. To her shock, the room was filled with photographs, snapshots of herself, her car, and various locations she frequented. The pictures were meticulously arranged, creating a disturbing mosaic of her daily life. Laura's blood ran cold as she realized the full scope of her situation. The figure outside wasn't just a random road rage incident. They had been following her, stalking her. The room was evidence of their obsession. A soft sound came from behind her, and Laura whirled around to see a figure stepping into the room. It was a man, but not the one from the SUV. His eyes were cold and calculating. "I see you found my collection," he said with a chilling calmness. "I've been watching you for a while." The realization hit Laura like a ton of bricks. The driver of the SUV was just a pawn in this twisted game. The real danger was inside the house all along. As she tried to back away, the man advanced, a sinister grin on his face. Laura's mind raced for an escape plan, but the door behind her slammed shut. Her only option was to confront her captor and hope for a miracle. The twist was that her initial fear was not misplaced. The man had indeed been stalking her for some time. But what Laura didn't know was that this man had a deeply personal vendetta. He had been tracking her every move to exact a cruel revenge for something that wasn't what it seemed. Laura's story, however, would take another chilling turn as the police arrived and discovered not just a deranged stalker, but an intricate plot that went far beyond mere road rage. The truth behind the stalker's motivations and the eerie connection to Laura's past revealed a darkness that went deeper than anyone could have imagined. The last drive. Megan's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the cold, black leather. The night had settled into an oppressive gloom, and the rain was falling in sheets, obscuring the road. She had been on the road for hours, driving back from a business trip, and fatigue had begun to gnaw at her resolve. The remote highway was barely lit, and the incessant thrum of the wipers did little to dispel the tension in her shoulders. As she rounded a bend, a pair of headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, Megan was relieved. Perhaps she'd find someone to share the lonely road with. But as the vehicle drew closer, the reassuring glow of headlights became a blinding glare. The car behind her was too close, too aggressive. Megan's anxiety spiked as the car flashed its high beams, signaling impatience. She tried to speed up, but the car mirrored her acceleration. Every time she tried to pass a slow-moving truck in the lane ahead, the aggressive vehicle veered into her blind spot, cutting her off. Her pulse quickened as she realized this wasn't just a case of poor driving etiquette. The car behind her was deliberately harassing her. Panic set in, and she pulled over to the shoulder, hoping the driver would pass. But instead, the car stopped behind her, its headlights casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Megan took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband asking her to hurry home. She began typing a quick response, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, where she saw the shadowy figure of the other driver getting out of the car. The figure walked toward her, their face obscured by the rain and darkness. Megan's heart raced. She considered her options. She could try to drive away, but the road was narrow and treacherous. She could call for help, but her phone's signal was spotty in this area. As the figure approached, Megan quickly locked her doors and reached for her phone. The figure, clad in a dark, rain-soaked coat, pounded on her window. The frantic energy in their movements was palpable, and Megan could hear their angry shouts over the roar of the rain. Summoning her courage, Megan rolled down the window just a crack. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I've had enough of your reckless driving." The figure shouted. "You nearly caused an accident back there." Megan's confusion deepened. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Before she could finish, the figure yanked the door open, water splashing into the car. Megan recoiled, her heart pounding. The driver's face was hidden by the brim of a hat, but their eyes were wild with fury. "Get out of the car," the driver demanded. Megan's instincts screamed at her to flee. She threw the car into gear and slammed on the gas. The car lurched forward, but the driver grabbed onto the door, running alongside the vehicle for a few terrifying seconds before letting go. Megan sped down the road, her breaths coming in short gasps. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the encounter. The car behind her had disappeared into the storm, but the fear that gripped her remained. Eventually, she saw a faint glow ahead, a small rest stop with a dimly lit diner and a gas station. Relief washed over her as she pulled into the parking lot, hoping to find safety and perhaps call the police. The rain continued to pelt down, creating a droning rhythm that seemed to match her frayed nerves. Inside the diner, Megan found a quiet booth. She ordered a coffee, her hands still trembling. As she waited, she noticed a man sitting at the counter, his face partially obscured by a newspaper. The man's presence seemed oddly comforting, and Megan found herself staring at him. The man lowered the newspaper and met her gaze. His eyes were calm, almost serene. "You look like you've had a rough night," he said softly. Megan nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You wouldn't believe what just happened to me." The man listened intently as Megan recounted the harrowing encounter with the aggressive driver. When she finished, the man's expression grew more serious. "It sounds like you've had a very close call." Megan sighed and took a sip of her coffee. "I don't know what to do. I just want to go home." The man leaned closer. "Sometimes the danger isn't just on the road. Sometimes it's right where you think you're safe." Megan's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table. Megan's eyes widened as she saw her own face staring back at her, but it was taken from inside her car through the rearview mirror. "This was taken a few miles from here," the man said. "The driver you encountered is someone I've been tracking for a long time. They've been targeting people like you, those who seem vulnerable and alone." Megan's heart pounded. "Why are you telling me this?" The man's eyes were solemn. "Because the person you saw was a decoy. The real danger is much closer than you think." A chill ran down Megan's spine. She glanced around the diner, noticing for the first time how empty it seemed. The rain outside was a relentless curtain of noise. Before she could react, the door to the diner creaked open. A familiar silhouette entered, dripping wet and shadowed. Megan's blood ran cold as she recognized the figure. It was the same aggressive driver who had harassed her on the road. The driver's eyes locked with hers, and a cold smile spread across their face. The man at the counter stood up, his calm demeanor replaced with a grim resolve. He moved between Megan and the driver. "It's time for you to leave," the man said, his voice low and firm. Megan's mind raced as she understood the full scope of the danger. The driver was not just an enraged individual, but part of a larger, sinister plot. Her initial encounter had been a carefully orchestrated plan to lure her into a trap. The driver hesitated, then turned and left the diner. Megan's heart pounded as she and the man watched him disappear into the rain. The man turned to Megan, his face now showing a hint of relief. "Get back to your car," he said. "I'll make sure you're not followed." Megan didn't need to be told twice. She hurried back to her car, her hands shaking as she started the engine. The man's warning echoed in her mind as she drove away from the rest stop, her mind racing with the realization that the true danger had been lurking far closer than she ever imagined. As she finally reached the safety of her home, she glanced back at the empty highway, her relief mingled with an uneasy sense of what might have been. The road rage she had experienced was only the surface of a much deeper terror, one that had nearly claimed her life in a twisted game of cat and mouse. Midnight reflection. Samantha's pulse quickened as she navigated the dark, winding road through the forest. The sun had long set, and the only light came from her car's headlights, slicing through the dense canopy of trees. She had taken this route before, but tonight felt different, darker and more menacing. The evening had started innocuously enough. Samantha had finished a late shift at work and was eager to get home. But when she'd reached the last stretch of highway, she found herself being tailgated by a large, black SUV. It had been driving close, almost bumping her rear bumper, making her uneasy. She had tried to change lanes to let the SUV pass, but it mirrored her moves, keeping its distance but never relinquishing it. Eventually, the SUV turned off onto a side road, and Samantha had felt a fleeting sense of relief. She had thought the ordeal was over. But as she continued along the remote road, the SUV's headlights reappeared in her rearview mirror. It was like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. Her anxiety spiked, and she began to drive faster, her tires skidding slightly on the wet road. The SUV stayed with her, maintaining a menacing presence. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching out like clawed hands. Samantha decided to pull over at the next turnoff, hoping to confront the driver or at least make a call for help. She found a small clearing with an old wooden sign that read, "Hidden Lake." She turned onto the gravel path, which led to a secluded area by a murky lake. She parked the car and turned off the engine. The night was eerily silent, except for the distant croaking of frogs and the steady patter of rain on the roof. She watched in her side mirror as the SUV followed her, its headlights casting long shadows across the clearing. It stopped a short distance behind her. The anxiety in her chest became a knot of fear as the driver's side door of the SUV opened. A figure emerged, dressed in dark clothes. Samantha's instincts screamed at her to stay in the car, but curiosity and a need for confrontation got the better of her. She slowly got out, trying to keep her breathing steady. "Hey!" she called out, her voice trembling. "What's your problem? Why are you following me?" The figure, now emerging from the SUV's shadow, was a man with a grim expression and intense eyes. He approached her, not saying a word. Samantha's heart pounded as she backed away, feeling increasingly cornered. "Look, I don't want any trouble," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm calling the police." The man stopped and suddenly seemed to relax. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice calm but eerie. "I'm here to help you." Samantha frowned, her fear battling with confusion. "Help me? From what?" The man glanced back at the SUV. "I've been following you because you're in danger. You need to leave this place right now." Samantha's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" The man looked around nervously. "There's something on this road, something not right. It's not safe." Before Samantha could respond, she heard a rustling noise coming from the woods behind her. The sound was too deliberate, too controlled. The man's face turned pale, and he grabbed her arm. "Get back in your car and drive! Now!" Panic surged through Samantha as she did as he said, jumping back into her car and starting the engine. The man quickly ran back to his SUV, and Samantha glanced in her rearview mirror, seeing him jump in and speed away. Her hands trembled as she drove away from the lake. The SUV was gone, and the road was once again deserted. She tried to make sense of the encounter, but found that her mind was too clouded with fear. The ominous presence of the woods and the man's warning kept her on edge. As she continued driving, she saw a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow darting between the trees. Her grip on the wheel tightened, and she glanced at the rearview mirror, but the road behind her was empty. Hours seemed to pass as she drove, her nerves on edge. The shadows of the forest gave way to open road, and she finally felt a sense of relief as she neared a small town. She decided to stop at a gas station to collect herself and call up the police. Inside the dimly lit station, she explained her ordeal to the attendant, who looked at her with concern. "I'll call the local sheriff," he said, and Samantha took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. As she waited, she looked out the window and saw the faint glow of headlights approaching. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the headlights were eerily familiar, the same black SUV from earlier. The SUV pulled into the station's lot and stopped. The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. Samantha's heart sank as she recognized him. He walked toward her, his expression now unreadable. The attendant saw the look of fear on Samantha's face and stepped forward, asking if everything was all right. The man nodded and said, "I just wanted to talk to her privately." Samantha's fear turned to confusion. "Why are you here?" she demanded. The man looked around and lowered his voice. "Because you need to know the truth about what happened tonight. There's something you need to see." Samantha's heart pounded as she followed the man to his SUV. He opened the back door and pulled out a large black folder. Inside were photos and documents about her car, and the paths she had driven. It was the same kind of evidence she had seen in the room at the rest stop. "This," the man said, "is evidence that you've been tracked for weeks. We've been investigating a series of abductions and attacks on people driving alone. The SUV you saw was not just a random driver, but part of a larger group." Samantha's mind reeled. "So you were?" The man nodded. "I'm with a private investigation team. We've been trying to protect you without alarming you. Why, the danger on this road is real, and we're doing everything we can to keep people safe." Samantha looked at the man, her fear mingled with a profound sense of relief. "Why didn't you just tell me that before?" The man's expression softened. "Because sometimes knowing too much can be more dangerous than not knowing. You needed to be safe, not terrified." As the local sheriff arrived and took over the investigation, Samantha finally understood the gravity of her situation. The road rage incident had been a ploy to get her to a safe place. The real danger lay in the sinister network, watching and waiting for their next victim. With the threat now known and the authorities involved, Samantha felt a cautious sense of safety. But as she drove away from the gas station, she couldn't shake the chilling realization that the night's events were just a glimpse into a darker, more pervasive danger that lurked beyond the shadows. The long haul. Jake's truck rumbled down the deserted highway, its engine a steady hum against the backdrop of a starless night. He had been driving for hours, making the long haul from the city to a small town where he was due to deliver a shipment of goods. It was a routine trip, but tonight an uneasy tension filled the air, as though the darkness outside was holding its breath. The highway stretched out before him, flanked by dense forests that seemed to close in more with every mile. The rain that had started earlier was now a steady downpour, obscuring the road and making visibility poor. Jake was used to driving in bad weather, but something about tonight's conditions felt different. As he passed a lone, dimly lit rest stop, a flash of headlights in his rearview mirror caught his attention. A sleek, dark sedan had pulled onto the highway behind him. Jake frowned, noting the car's aggressive speed and the way it seemed to close the distance between them. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It wasn't unusual to see cars late at night, but the sedan's behavior struck him as odd. It stayed close, almost tailgating, despite the wet conditions. Jake tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead, but the car's presence was unsettling. After a few miles, the sedan's high beams flashed, blinding Jake momentarily. He squinted and adjusted his mirrors, but the car remained dangerously close. He tried to increase his speed to put some distance between them, but the sedan matched his pace. Jake's apprehension grew as the car continued to shadow him, its headlights like a pair of predatory eyes. He decided to pull over at the next turnout, hoping the car would pass. He slowed and turned onto a narrow, poorly lit side road, hoping to find a safe place to stop and figure out what was going on. The side road was even more isolated, flanked by tall, dense trees. He parked the truck and turned off the engine, his headlights cutting through the darkness. The sedan followed him, its headlights briefly illuminating the truck before the car came to a stop behind him. Jake watched in the side mirror as the sedan's driver's side door opened. A tall figure stepped out, their face hidden by the rain and shadow. Jake's heart raced. He had no idea what the driver wanted, but the sense of danger was palpable. He hesitated, then reached for the CB radio, hoping to contact a fellow trucker or the authorities. Just as he picked up the microphone, a knock on his window startled him. He looked up to see the figure standing outside, rain streaming off their coat. "Can I help you?" Jake called through the closed window, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they moved to the front of the truck, peering through the windshield. Jake's unease grew. The figure then walked around the truck and knocked on the passenger side window. "Look," Jake said, cracking the window slightly. "If this is about something, let's talk about it." "I'm just trying to do my job." The figure finally spoke, their voice muffled by the rain. "You need to leave. There's something on this road." Jake frowned. "What are you talking about?" The figure took a deep breath, their tone serious. "You're not alone out here. There's a danger you don't see." Before Jake could respond, the figure abruptly turned and walked back to their sedan. Jake watched as the car's headlights flashed on, illuminating a sign that read "Dead End" at the end of the side road. His anxiety surged. Without another word, the sedan sped off down the road, leaving Jake alone with the growing sense of dread. He glanced at the "Dead End" sign and felt a chill. If the sedan had been trying to warn him, it meant something was wrong. He debated whether to continue on the side road or return to the highway. The road was narrow and winding, and he felt trapped. Deciding to head back, he started the truck and carefully maneuvered it around, heading back toward the highway. As he drove, the rain intensified, and the road became slick. The truck's tires struggled to maintain traction. Jake's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, where he saw the faint glow of headlights approaching from behind. His heart sank as he realized the headlights were unmistakably those of the sedan. The sedan closed in, its high beams flashing again. Jake's panic rose. He tried to speed up, but the sedan matched his pace, closing the gap. The road was growing more treacherous, with sharp turns and limited visibility. Then, without warning, the sedan pulled alongside Jake's truck and began to push him, forcing him toward the edge of the road. Jake fought to keep control, but the sedan's aggressive maneuvering was pushing him closer to the trees. Desperate, Jake slammed on the brakes and swerved, narrowly avoiding the trees as the sedan shot past him. He managed to regain control and continued down the road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He glanced at the CB radio again, hoping for some sign of help. The radio crackled and a voice came through, but it was garbled and unintelligible. Jake's frustration grew as he realized he was completely isolated. Suddenly, the road took a sharp turn, and Jake saw a small, dilapidated house up ahead. It was an eerie, abandoned structure, its windows dark and vacant. He had no choice but to pull over and take refuge. He parked the truck beside the house and climbed out, looking around warily. The sedan had disappeared, but the sense of danger remained. He approached the house, hoping to find shelter or at least a phone. As he entered the house, he was met with an unsettling silence. The interior was musty and covered in dust. He moved cautiously, checking for any signs of life. In a corner of the room, he found a stack of old newspapers and photographs. His blood ran cold as he saw a photo of himself taken from inside his truck. The realization hit him with a jolt. He had been followed, and the danger was far worse than he had imagined. The sedan had been part of a larger scheme, watching and tracking him all along. The figure's warning had been a desperate attempt to protect him from a far more sinister trap. Jake turned to leave the house, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He spun around, heart racing. The room was suddenly filled with shadowy figures, their faces obscured. "You should have listened," one of the figures said, their voice chillingly calm. Jake's mind raced as he realized the truth. The figures were not just random assailants, but part of a larger, malevolent group with a plan that involved much more than a simple road rage incident. As the figures advanced, Jake's instincts kicked in. He grabbed a heavy object from the floor and prepared to defend himself. The figures were closing in, their intentions clear. Jake fought back with everything he had, desperate to escape the nightmarish situation. In the end, it was a desperate struggle for survival. The true horror of the road lay not just in the danger of the highway, but in the unseen forces lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jake's long haul had led him into a trap far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. The Watcher. It had been a grueling day for Ben, an overworked insurance adjuster who had just finished a grueling series of meetings. The late summer sun had dipped below the horizon, and he was finally heading home along the deserted rural highway that wound through dense forests. As he drove, the rhythmic hum of his car's engine was a small comfort against the eerie quiet of the countryside. The road ahead was straight and narrow, bordered by thick trees that cast dark shadows in the twilight. Ben had always found this stretch of road unsettling, especially after dark. The trees seemed to press in closer every time he drove this route, as if they were closing in on him. As he settled into the monotony of the drive, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. Ben wasn't overly concerned at first. It was not unusual to see another vehicle on this road. However, as the car drew closer, he noticed it was a sleek black sedan, its headlights glaring brightly despite the absence of any traffic. The sedan followed closely behind him, unnervingly close. Ben glanced at his speedometer and realized he was well within the speed limit, so there was no reason for such aggressive tailgating. He tried to ignore it and focused on the road, but the sedan remained glued to his bumper, its headlights washing over his car like a floodlight. After a few miles of this intimidating proximity, Ben decided to pull over at a small, old-fashioned rest area that appeared suddenly on the side of the road. He hoped that the sedan would pass, but it slowed and followed him into the rest area. Ben parked and got out of his car, his unease growing. The black sedan parked a few spaces away, and the driver's side door opened. A tall figure emerged, cloaked in a dark coat, their face obscured by the hood of their jacket. The figure approached him with an unsettling, deliberate calmness. "Can I help you?" Ben called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they continued walking toward him, their movements measured. Ben felt a shiver run down his spine. He took a cautious step back, trying to gauge the stranger's intentions. "Look," Ben said, his voice trembling slightly, "I don't want any trouble. I'll just wait for you to leave, okay?" The figure finally spoke, their voice muffled and almost mechanical. "You shouldn't have stopped." Ben's anxiety flared into panic. "What do you mean?" The figure stopped a few feet away and raised their head slightly. For the first time, Ben saw a pair of cold, dark eyes staring at him. "You're not alone out here. There's something watching you." Before Ben could react, the figure turned and walked back to their sedan, which had now started its engine. The headlights illuminated the rest area in a harsh, unforgiving light. The sedan drove off, disappearing into the darkness. Ben was left alone, the chill of fear clinging to him. He quickly got back into his car, locked the doors, and started the engine. His mind raced as he pulled out of the rest area and back onto the highway. The black sedan's warning echoed in his head, and he felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. The darkness outside seemed to press in, and the occasional rustle of leaves made him jump. He kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black sedan tailing him again. When Ben finally saw the lights of his town in the distance, a wave of relief washed over him. He drove through the familiar streets, feeling somewhat safer within the confines of the town. As he approached his house, he noticed something odd, a figure standing at the edge of his driveway, illuminated by the headlights of his car. Ben's heart skipped a beat as he realized the figure was wearing a similar dark coat and hood as the stranger from the rest area. The figure stood motionless, staring at him. Ben slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop, his fear escalating. The figure didn't move, their face still hidden. Ben fumbled for his phone, but his hands were shaking too much to dial properly. He finally managed to call the police, his voice panicked as he explained the situation. The dispatcher assured him that officers would be dispatched immediately. Meanwhile, Ben kept his eyes on the figure, who remained eerily still. He decided to stay in his car and keep a safe distance. Minutes felt like hours as he waited. The sound of approaching sirens was a small comfort. When the police arrived, they quickly approached the figure. As they got closer, the figure's hood fell back, revealing a face Ben recognized, his own. The doppelganger, or so it seemed, was a perfect mirror image of Ben. The police officers looked bewildered as they examined the figure. One officer turned to Ben, confusion etched on his face. "Do you have any idea who this might be?" Ben stared, his mind racing. "No, I've never seen this person before. How is this possible?" The officer examined the figure, who seemed to be in a trance, unresponsive to their questions. They decided to take the figure into custody, but the strange encounter left Ben shaken. After the police left, Ben went inside his house, still trying to comprehend what had happened. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It read, "You should have listened. Next time, don't stop." Ben's blood ran cold as he realized that the encounter at the rest area had been a warning about something far more sinister. The doppelganger's presence was a chilling reminder that the danger was not just on the road, but had followed him home. He locked all the doors and windows and tried to calm himself, but the unsettling feeling of being watched lingered. The long drive had led him to an encounter that defied explanation and left him with a haunting question. Who or what had been watching him all along, and why? Title: The Last Turn. The winding mountain road was known for its treacherous curves and sudden drops. It was a route that locals avoided unless necessary. But tonight, Mark Thompson was making the drive home from a late meeting, his frustration growing with each mile. He had been on the road for hours, and fatigue combined with a particularly stressful day had frayed his nerves. Mark's sleek sedan roared up the serpentine path, weaving between the shadows cast by the dense pine forest. It was just past midnight, and the road was deserted save for a pair of distant headlights bobbing ahead of him. He gritted his teeth and tapped his fingers on the steering wheel in a rhythm of annoyance. The vehicle in front of him seemed to be going even slower than usual. Its taillights flickered intermittently, like the heartbeat of some old, troubled creature. Mark's patience wore thin as he tightened his grip on the wheel and began to tailgate, the glaring headlights of his car illuminating the rear of the vehicle ahead. After a few minutes of this, the car ahead suddenly swerved violently to the side, its tires screeching. Mark's heart leaped into his throat as he slammed on the brakes, his car skidding across the asphalt. The car in front, a battered old pickup truck, had stopped abruptly, its engine still running. "Are you kidding me?" Mark muttered, his anger boiling over. He threw his car into park and stormed out, the cold night air biting into his skin. His breath misted in front of him as he approached the truck, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The driver's side door creaked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. He had a scruffy beard and wore a weathered leather jacket. His eyes were shadowed by a faded cap, but Mark could feel his gaze piercing through the darkness. "What's your problem?" Mark demanded, his voice edged with irritation. The man's face remained expressionless. "You think you can push people around on this road? You don't know the rules out here." Mark was taken aback. "Rules? What are you talking about? You nearly caused an accident." The man's eyes, now visible under the brim of his cap, were cold and emotionless. "This road's not what it seems. You don't understand what happens here. Just turn back while you still can." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, whatever. I'm done with this." He turned and walked back to his car, his anger mingling with unease. As he got back into his sedan, he noticed the pickup truck hadn't moved. Mark didn't want to spend another minute on this desolate road, so he sped off, leaving the truck behind. The road twisted and turned as he drove faster, eager to escape the unsettling encounter. But as he rounded a sharp bend, he saw a flash of headlights in his rearview mirror. The pickup truck had reappeared, its lights glaring like malevolent eyes. Mark's heart pounded as he accelerated, the road curving more dangerously with each second. The pickup was relentless, staying right on his tail, its headlights glaring into Mark's mirrors. The terror began to seep into Mark's composure. He gripped the wheel, sweat trickling down his face as he maneuvered through the winding road. Every turn seemed to bring the truck closer, its engine growling ominously. He attempted to lose the truck by taking a sudden detour down a narrow, overgrown path that branched off the main road. His tires struggled for traction on the loose gravel, and the truck's headlights still pierced through the darkness, relentless. Mark drove furiously, adrenaline coursing through him as he fought for control. He skidded around another sharp corner and saw a small, dilapidated cabin ahead. In desperation, he darted toward it, hoping to find refuge. He screeched to a halt outside the cabin and stumbled out of the car, racing toward the door. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried the handle. It was locked. He pounded on the door, but no one answered. Behind him, the rumble of the truck's engine grew louder. In a panic, Mark noticed a window slightly ajar. He squeezed through it and landed inside the cabin, which was filled with dusty furniture and cobwebs. The dim light of his cell phone was the only source of illumination. He heard the truck's engine stop outside. Mark hid behind an old wooden dresser, his heart racing as he listened for any signs of movement. He heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, and then the creak of the cabin's front door. Shadows danced across the walls as the door opened at Kirchenschaft, and the footsteps came closer. The truck's driver, the same man from earlier, entered the cabin, his form looming in the doorway. Mark could see him scanning the room, his expression unreadable. Mark held his breath, trying to stay as silent as possible. Suddenly, the man turned and looked directly at the dresser where Mark was hiding. A chilling silence enveloped the room as the man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Mark's pulse quickened, and he was about to make a desperate dash for the window when the man spoke. "You didn't listen," the man said, his voice soft but menacing. "Now you have to face the consequences." Mark's mind raced, trying to figure out how to escape. But before he could act, the man pulled out a small, dusty book from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto the floor. The book fell open, and Mark could see the words scrawled inside, written in a strange, archaic script. The man's voice took on a grave tone. "This road is cursed. It's not just about anger or road rage. It's about something much older, something that claims those who defy its rules." Mark's eyes widened as he glanced at the book, a chill running down his spine. What are you talking about?" The man's expression softened slightly. "This is the last turn you'll ever make. You should have heeded the warnings." Mark's confusion turned to terror as he realized the truth. The man wasn't just some angry driver. He was a guardian of the cursed road, and Mark had been led into a trap, a final, inevitable end on this twisted path. The last thing Mark saw was the man's face, now with a hint of pity, before the darkness enveloped him completely. The truck's headlights cast a final, eerie glow on the cabin before everything went black. In the morning, the cabin was empty. The pickup truck was gone, and Mark's car was found abandoned on the road. The authorities never found any trace of him, and the road remained as treacherous and mysterious as ever, a place where the shadows held their secrets tight, waiting for the next driver who didn't heed the warning. The tailgater. The sun had long disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the rural highway bathed in the pale light of a waning moon. Emily Harper was exhausted, her eyes heavy as she navigated the dark road. She had spent the day visiting her ailing mother and was now making the 3-hour drive home, her patience worn thin. The highway was typically deserted, but tonight Emily couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was off. She glanced at the rearview mirror and noticed a set of headlights following her at a consistent distance. At first, she thought little of it. After all, it was a lonely stretch of road. But as the minutes ticked by, the headlights remained unwavering, never increasing or decreasing in distance. Emily's unease grew. She sped up slightly, and so did the car behind her. She slowed down, and the car behind her did the same. Her heart began to race. She reached for her phone to call for help, but noticed the signal was non-existent in this remote area. She decided to pull over, hoping that if she let the car pass, it would move on. She pulled onto the narrow shoulder and waited. The other car's headlights remained fixed on her. The minutes ticked by, the tension rising as the other car continued to sit behind her. Finally, Emily had enough. She got out of her car and approached the other vehicle, a dark, intimidating SUV. The driver's side window was tinted, making it impossible to see inside. She knocked on the window, but there was no response. Just as she was about to turn back to her car, the SUV's engine roared to life. Emily jumped back as the vehicle pulled away, the headlights briefly blinding her before it vanished into the distance. She sighed in relief, shaking her head in disbelief. She got back into her car and resumed her drive, trying to shake off the creepy encounter. As she drove on, she noticed the occasional glint of headlights in her rearview mirror, but it was always fleeting. About 30 minutes later, as Emily neared a particularly dark and isolated stretch of road, she saw the SUV again. This time it was parked on the side of the road, its engine off. A chill ran down her spine. Her instincts screamed at her to drive past quickly, but something compelled her to investigate. She slowly rolled down her window as she approached the SUV. Just then, the SUV's engine roared to life once more, and it began to follow her, maintaining a menacing proximity. Emily's hands gripped the wheel, her knuckles turning white as she accelerated, hoping to outdistance her pursuer. The SUV kept pace with her, its headlights piercing through the dark like predatory eyes. Panic surged through Emily as she took a series of sharp turns, desperately trying to lose the SUV. But no matter how fast or erratically she drove, the SUV was always right behind her. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Emily spotted an old, abandoned farmhouse in the distance. She swerved off the road and drove up the overgrown path leading to the farmhouse. The SUV followed, its tires crunching on the gravel. Emily stopped in front of the dilapidated structure and scrambled out of her car. The farmhouse, though decrepit, seemed like a place to hide. She bolted inside, slamming the door behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she listened for any sounds. She heard footsteps approaching the farmhouse, the sound of the SUV's engine idling outside. Emily's heart pounded as she searched for a place to hide. She found a small room at the back of the house, its door creaking as she entered. It was filled with dusty furniture and old forgotten relics. As she crouched in the corner, she could see the glow of the SUV's headlights through a crack in the door. The engine cut off, and the footsteps grew louder, heading toward the entrance of the house. Suddenly, the front door of the farmhouse burst open. Emily held her breath, trying to stay as silent as possible. The footsteps echoed through the house, moving from room to room. A figure appeared in the doorway of her hiding spot. It was a tall man wearing a dark hoodie, his face obscured by shadows. Emily's fear surged as the man stepped closer, a sense of foreboding filling the air. "You've been warned," the man said, his voice low and almost mournful. "You've been warned about this road." Emily's eyes widened in terror. "Why are you doing this?" The man stepped into the light, revealing a face marked with deep lines and an expression of resignation. "This road is cursed. Those who defy it are doomed to wander its path forever." Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. "What do you mean? I don't understand." The man's gaze softened. "I'm one of the few who've seen what happens to those who ignore the signs. I try to warn people, to keep them safe. But you didn't listen, and now..." Before Emily could respond, the man's figure began to fade, the shadows seeming to swallow him. In a blink, he was gone. The farmhouse was silent again, save for the distant hum of the SUV's engine starting up. Emily stumbled out of the room, her fear mounting. She found her way back to her car, but the SUV had disappeared. She drove away, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. The next morning, Emily was found by a passing motorist, disoriented and shaken. Her car was still at the farmhouse, but there was no sign of the SUV or the man. The authorities investigated, but found no trace of anything unusual, only an old farmhouse and a frightened woman. Emily never drove that road again, and the farmhouse fell into disrepair, a ghostly relic of the night she encountered the tailgater. The locals spoke of the cursed road in hushed tones, and the legend of the tailgater continued to haunt the desolate highway, waiting for the next driver who didn't heed the warnings. Titled The Midnight Drive. Claire Harris had always been an avid road tripper, relishing the solitude and freedom that came with the open road. But tonight, after a grueling week of work and a long drive through the night, she was ready to be home. The rural highway she was on was a familiar one she had driven countless times without incident. However, tonight felt different. The sky was an inky black and the road stretched endlessly before her. As Claire drove, she noticed a pair of headlights in her rearview mirror. The vehicle behind her seemed to be maintaining a steady distance, neither speeding up nor slowing down. Claire, tired and annoyed, found it odd but tried to dismiss it. The headlights were so close they felt invasive, like they were prying into her personal space. After a while, the car behind began to exhibit odd behavior. It would periodically flash its high beams at her, only to retreat back to regular headlights, then flash again. Each time, Claire felt a jolt of irritation and unease. She increased her speed, hoping the other driver would take the hint and overtake her. Instead, the car followed her every move, its headlights unwavering. Claire's anxiety spiked. She decided to pull over at a rest area that she knew was just ahead. She needed a break, and if this car was just looking for a place to stop, she hoped it would leave her alone once she was out of sight. She pulled into the dimly lit rest area and parked. The car behind followed her in and parked a few spaces away. Claire watched nervously from her window, her heart racing. The other driver remained in their car, the headlights off, but the engine running. Claire debated whether to confront the driver or just wait it out. Gathering her courage, Claire stepped out of her car and walked towards the other vehicle. The rest area was eerily quiet, that with only the distant hum of the highway in the background. As she approached the other car, she noticed it was a dark-colored sedan and its windows were heavily tinted. Before she could reach the driver's side window, the other car's engine roared to life, and the headlights blazed back on. The car began to inch forward slowly, its headlights illuminating Claire's face. Panic surged through her, and she quickly retreated to her car, locking the doors. The other car's headlights followed her every movement, staying just behind her. Claire's mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do. She started her engine and pulled out of the rest area, hoping to put some distance between herself and the unsettling vehicle. As she drove, the other car stayed right on her tail, maintaining a constant distance. Claire took a series of winding turns, hoping to lose her pursuer, but the car behind her mirrored every turn, never faltering. Her fear grew with each passing mile, and her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She decided to take a more isolated road, one she rarely used, hoping it would lead her away from the constant presence of the other car. The road was narrow and winding, lined with dense trees that cast ominous shadows. Still, the car behind her followed, its headlights piercing through the darkness like a persistent predator. Suddenly, Claire spotted a small, rundown house at the edge of the road. It was abandoned, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling. Desperate for some form of sanctuary, Claire pulled into the driveway and parked in front of the house. She waited, her breath coming in short bursts as she watched the car behind slowly come to a stop a few yards away. The driver's side door of the other car creaked open, and a figure emerged. Claire could barely make out the shape of a person moving toward the house. In a moment of sheer panic, she scrambled out of her car and dashed toward the house, hoping to find a place to hide. She slipped inside through a broken window and found herself in a dusty, decrepit living room. The house was eerily silent, save for the distant sound of footsteps approaching. Claire hid behind a rotting armchair, her heart pounding as she heard the front door of the house creak open. The footsteps grew louder, moving from room to room. Claire held her breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The shadowy figure appeared in the doorway of the room where she was hiding, but the dim light made it difficult to see clearly. The figure spoke, their voice echoing in the stillness. "You shouldn't have come here." Claire's fear reached a fever pitch as she realized the voice was not threatening, but sorrowful. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a man in his mid-40s with a weary, lined face. He looked at her with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to scare you. I was just trying to warn you." Claire was confused, her fear mingling with bewilderment. "Warn me? Warn me about what?" The man's expression grew somber. "This road, it's cursed. Those who drive it at night, those who ignore the signs, they end up like me. I'm stuck here, forever driving this road, trying to protect others from the same fate." Claire's eyes widened as she began to understand. The man was a spectral guardian, bound to the road by a curse, doomed to chase away those who ventured onto it. His actions, though terrifying, were meant to protect her from the same fate he suffered. Before Claire could say anything more, the man began to fade, his form dissolving into the darkness of the abandoned house. The footsteps retreated, and the silence returned. Claire emerged from her hiding place, her mind reeling from the encounter. She made her way back to her car and drove away, the haunted house disappearing into the distance behind her. As she left the cursed road, she glanced back one last time, feeling a deep sense of both relief and melancholy. The road would remain a dark reminder of the night she encountered the spectral guardian, and she would never forget the lesson learned. Sometimes the most frightening experiences come not from malevolence, but from the desperate attempts of those trapped in their own nightmarish reality. Title: The Phantom Lane. The small town of Elmsfield was known for its sleepy streets and serene landscapes, but it harbored one secret that few spoke about: Phantom Lane. The old road, once a bustling shortcut, had fallen into disrepair and was now a forgotten path, rumored to be haunted. Most locals avoided it, but Lisa Carter, a young journalist with a penchant for uncovering mysteries, was determined to unravel the truth. Lisa had heard the tales of Phantom Lane during her research for a story on local legends. Supposedly, the road was cursed after a series of tragic accidents decades ago, and anyone who ventured down it after dark would be plagued by malevolent spirits. Unperturbed by the superstitions, Lisa decided to drive through the lane one evening, hoping to debunk the myth or uncover something tangible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lisa set off in her reliable old sedan. The highway leading to Phantom Lane was deserted, and the air grew colder as she approached. The entrance to the lane was marked by an old, rusting sign barely visible through the overgrowth. Lisa took a deep breath and turned onto the crumbling asphalt. The lane was a narrow, winding path bordered by twisted trees whose branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. The moonlight filtered through the dense foliage, casting eerie shadows that danced along the road. Lisa's headlights cut through the darkness, but the dense forest seemed to swallow the light. After a few minutes of driving, Lisa noticed something peculiar in her rearview mirror. A set of headlights had appeared behind her, following at a close distance. She initially thought it might be another vehicle using the lane, but the headlights were unsettlingly constant and unblinking. Growing uneasy, Lisa accelerated slightly, hoping to put some distance between herself and the tailgater. To her dismay, the headlights mirrored her every move, remaining steadfastly behind her. She took a sharp turn, hoping to lose the mysterious vehicle, but it stayed right on her tail. Her anxiety grew with each passing minute. The road twisted and turned, and the trees seemed to close in around her. She tried to make sense of the situation, but her mind raced with fear and curiosity. Who was following her, and why? As she rounded a particularly sharp bend, she noticed a dilapidated farmhouse up ahead. Desperate for a break, Lisa decided to pull over and investigate. She parked in front of the house and glanced at her rearview mirror. The headlights of the car behind her remained, but the vehicle itself was not visible through the trees. Lisa hesitated but decided to get out and investigate. She approached the farmhouse, which was in a state of severe disrepair, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness. The moment she stepped onto the creaking porch, a voice echoed from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." Lisa spun around but saw no one. The voice had been soft and haunting, carrying an eerie sense of urgency. Her heart pounded as she slowly approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar. Inside, the farmhouse was filled with dust and cobwebs. As she ventured further in, she noticed a faded photograph on the wall, depicting a group of people in front of the very farmhouse. Their faces were somber, their eyes filled with a deep sadness. One of the figures in the photograph looked eerily familiar, a man with a strong resemblance to the person who had followed her. The sound of footsteps made her jump. Lisa spun around to see a man emerging from the shadows, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. He wore old-fashioned clothing, and his demeanor was both sorrowful and intense. "You're not supposed to be here," he said again, his voice carrying a sense of mournful authority. "This road, it takes people who come looking for trouble." Lisa's fear intensified, but her journalistic instincts took over. "Who are you? What's happening?" The man's gaze softened slightly. "I'm one of the ones who died here. This road was cursed long ago, and we, those who remain, are bound to it, doomed to prevent others from suffering the same fate." Lisa's eyes widened. "You're saying the road is dangerous?" The man nodded, his expression a mixture of sadness and resignation. "The curse takes those who dare to challenge it. It's not just about spirits, it's about the road itself. You must leave before it's too late." Lisa's mind raced. She turned and fled back to her car, the man's words echoing in her ears. As she reached her vehicle, she saw the headlights of the car that had been following her growing brighter, but the car itself was still hidden in the trees. Without a second thought, she jumped into her car and sped away, her heart pounding with fear. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows closing in around her. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the headlights following her, growing closer with each passing second. In a desperate attempt to escape, Lisa took a series of wild turns and swerves, but the headlights stayed fixed on her. The lane twisted and turned more sharply than she remembered, and the trees seemed to close in tighter. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline, she reached the end of the lane and emerged onto a more familiar road. She glanced back to see the headlights vanish as she left Phantom Lane behind. She drove on, her hands trembling on the wheel and her breath coming in ragged gasps. When Lisa finally arrived home, she recounted her experience with a mix of disbelief and relief. The story she had intended to investigate had turned into a chilling encounter with the supernatural. She decided not to publish her findings, knowing that the truth about Phantom Lane was far more unsettling than any legend. The legend of Phantom Lane continued to haunt Elmsfield, and Lisa knew she would never drive that road again. The cursed lane remained a dark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the next curious soul who dared to uncover its secrets. Title: The Forgotten Road. It was a crisp autumn evening when Daniel Mercer, an avid photographer, set out on what he hoped would be a routine teen excursion. He had heard whispers about an old, forgotten road on the outskirts of his town, a place rumored to be shrouded in mystery. With his camera in hand, Daniel decided to investigate the road before the last light of day faded away. The road, known locally as Lost Hollow Lane, had long been abandoned. Overgrown with weeds and barely visible through the dense forest, it had become little more than a forgotten relic of the past. According to local lore, the road had been the site of a series of unexplained disappearances many years ago. Despite the eerie tales, Daniel was more intrigued than frightened. As he drove deeper into the forest, the sun dipped below the horizon and the road grew darker. Daniel's headlights illuminated the twisted trees that flanked the narrow path, their gnarled branches seeming to reach out like clawed hands. He followed the winding road, the uneven surface making his car bounce slightly. The further he drove, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. His headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and a sense of unease settled over him. As he rounded a particularly sharp bend, he noticed something odd. A faint flickering light ahead, as if someone had left a lantern burning. Curiosity piqued, Daniel decided to investigate. He parked his car and approached the source of the light. As he got closer, he realized it was coming from an old, decrepit farmhouse. The structure was barely standing, its windows shattered and its roof caved in. The light seemed to flicker from within the house, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Daniel hesitated for a moment before pushing open the creaking front door. Inside, the house was filled with an oppressive silence. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the faint light. The flickering came from an old oil lamp sitting on a rickety table in the center of the room. Its light cast a warm glow that seemed oddly out of place in the dilapidated surroundings. Daniel pulled out his camera and began taking pictures of the room. The lamp's light created hauntingly beautiful patterns on the walls, and he was captivated by the atmosphere. As he snapped a few more shots, he noticed a small, leather-bound journal lying next to the lamp. He picked up the journal, its cover worn and cracked. Flipping through the pages, he discovered a series of hastily written entries detailing the experiences of someone trapped in the house. The entries were filled with frantic scribbles about hearing footsteps, seeing shadowy figures, and the feeling of being constantly watched. A chill ran down Daniel's spine as he read the final entry, which was dated decades earlier. It spoke of a mysterious figure that haunted the road and the house, a figure that would appear at dusk and would follow anyone who dared to enter the area. As he closed the journal, Daniel heard a noise, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the house. He froze, his camera hanging loosely at his side. The noise grew louder, echoing through the empty rooms. His heart raced as he tried to locate the source of the sound. Suddenly, the oil lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Daniel fumbled for his flashlight and turned it on, casting a beam of light that cut through the gloom. The growling had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. He turned back to the table and saw that the journal was now open to a new page, one that had not been there before. The handwriting on the page was different, neater, but with a sense of urgency. It read, "Beware the shadow that follows. It is not of this world, but of another. Leave while you still can." Daniel's blood ran cold. He knew he had to leave. He quickly grabbed his camera and flashlight, rushing toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he heard the growling again, closer this time. It was as if something was moving through the darkness, approaching him. He burst through the door and ran back to his car, his heart pounding. As he sped away from the farmhouse, he glanced in his rearview mirror. The light in the farmhouse flickered back on, casting a faint glow that seemed to chase him down the road. The forest seemed to close in around him as he drove, the shadows twisting and shifting in his peripheral vision. The road, once a familiar path, now felt like a labyrinth of darkness and fear. Daniel's breaths came in ragged gasps as he desperately navigated the winding turns. Finally, he emerged onto a more well-lit road and drove straight home, his hands trembling on the wheel. He locked all the doors and sat in his living room, the haunting images of the farmhouse and the growling shadow replaying in his mind. The next day, Daniel returned to the farmhouse with a local historian, hoping to investigate further. But when they arrived, the house was gone. There was nothing but an overgrown patch of forest where the farmhouse had stood. The historian was baffled, and Daniel felt a deep sense of dread. He never went back to Lost Hollow Lane. The experience left him with a haunting sense of the unknown, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks in forgotten places. The farmhouse, the growling shadow, and the eerie journal remained a mystery, forever etched in Daniel's memory. The legend of Lost Hollow Lane continued to live on, a cautionary tale for those who dared to explore the forgotten and the unexplained.